up for our next panel. We'll ask the panelists to come up in front who are going to talk about some of the discussion that's been going on today and what do they see as the policy issues and opportunities. And as I did before, I'm going to introduce everyone to start with, and then we'll, if the panel wants to go up in the front, and then we'll ask each speaker to take about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion with the audience. So our first speaker is will be Senator Scott Dibble, who is chair of the Minnesota State Senate Transportation and Public Safety Committee and Finance Division. He is the past chair of the National Conference of State Legislatures Transportation Committee and has been involved not only in Minnesota but nationally on transportation policy issues. He has been he was originally in the House of Representatives in 2000, then was elected to the State Senate in 2002. He gained national fame this year as the chief author of legislation to give same-sex couples the freedom to marry. The bill was passed and signed into law in May of 2013, making Minnesota the 12th state to legalize same-sex marriage. He also happens to be my state senator, so thank you. Our second speaker will be the other side of the political aisle. I didn't mention Scott is a Democrat and Michael Beard is a Republican, so we have some bipartisan representation here. He's been in the Minnesota State House of Representatives since 2003. He's a board member of he was a board member of the Minnesota Regional Transit Board in the 1990s and also served on the Shakopee City Council. And he is the ranking member of the House Transportation Finance Committee, and we actually have the chair in the audience too. They've traded roles back and forth, so they work as a team against each other, I guess. Is that right?
Sometimes for each other.
And sometimes together, yes. And he also has a background in the railroad industry, which maybe he can tell us about when he speaks. Our third speaker is Louis Jambois, or Jambois, as
Anything you want to call me, Lee.
Jim Oberstar says, it's Jambois. Correct the French here. And he's president of the St. Paul Port Authority, manages the Public Economic Development Agency with primary responsibilities of managing the St. Paul Harbor, directing industrial development efforts within St. Paul, providing business financial assistance, and providing customized job training. The mission of the St. Paul Port Authority is to stimulate job creation, grow the city's tax base, and foster sustainable development. And our final speaker will be Bill Gardner, who is director of the Office of Freight and Commercial Vehicle Operations for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. And as director of MnDOT's Office of Freight, Bill manages the department's freight planning, freight rail, ports and waterways, and motor carrier programs. He has 33 years of multimodal transportation planning operations and management experience. And you're the guy that has to do the plan, is that right? We're going to start off with Senator Dibble.
Thanks so much, and thank you for inviting me here today. And can't respond to what the discussion has been today because I just arrived a few minutes ago. But I have glanced at the presentation and glanced at some of the beginnings of the work of the FRED study, and of course I'm familiar with the state rail, passenger and freight rail plan that was developed in the last few years. So I'm probably going to more admire the problem than drop a bunch of solutions on the table here, because I think it might have already been discussed here, and certainly one of the findings in this presentation is that The level of awareness around freight, what it is, how big it is, what role it plays, what part it plays in our economy, et cetera, is fairly low among the larger public, and that's directly reflected in the level of awareness among legislators. And frankly, we don't deal a lot with freight issues at the state legislature. I think it's interesting to know that, and I think most people would not know that a third of our freight tonnage is carried by rail in Minnesota, and we have the eighth largest or eighth highest number of track miles in the country. It's not super surprising to me to learn those things because, of course, we have a very large and robust roadway system that kind of speaks to, is larger than you would expect from a state of our size. I think that is testament to the kinds of investments, the kind of economy, the kind of state that we built in the past. But freight is one of those things that is like a lot of other systems. And I actually talk about and think about this quite a bit, the fact that we show up at a grocery store and the food is just kind of there, and we turn on the tap and the water's just kind of there, and we flip a switch and the electricity is kind of there, and we throw away our garbage and it just vanishes. And freight brings stuff to us, and sometimes it's annoying because we have to stop and allow the freight train to pass in front of us before we can continue on our merry way. And so we just don't think about it. We take it for granted. It's just kind of there. And that is directly translatable into the kinds of issues that we deal with. The stuff that we talk about the most as state legislators and committee in terms of resources and policy probably relate more directly to the smaller class 3s, the mom and pops, the little rickety lines that have been saved from obsolescence that can only run trains at 5 miles an hour and serve a few little towns and maybe 2 or 3 customers along the route that eventually make their way up to a main line. And we've got local legislators who are keenly attuned to the importance of those. And we have the Mercy funds, of course, the revolving loan fund, and we try to replenish that with money from time to time so that we can help out with those tracks and make sure that trains don't tip over or fall off bridges along those lines. And sometimes we forgive those loans, and that seems kind of cool. We do some improvements to crossings so that maybe we don't have to wait as long, or we can wait in a safer manner in our cars as trains cross our roads and streets. And then we deal a lot with the really annoying problems as freight rail interfaces with our communities and our neighborhoods. And as a matter of fact, just yesterday, a state legislator from kind of your neck of the woods, southern South Metro, train cars just sitting there adjacent to a residential neighborhood, and
I could probably tell you who it was.
They're very, very crabby about that, and they want either a big, beautiful fence to be built to block their view, or have those train cars moved out of the way. Trains that move through towns at too fast a rate of speed, those kinds of things. So that's what we deal with a lot. And so we really need to have a fuller understanding of what the problems are that we need to solve in the larger picture in terms of economic opportunity and the role that freight is playing, and the opportunities that we don't want to miss, the opportunities that are available to us in terms of freight. The other major annoying issue that we have to deal with from time to time is this whole idea of captive markets. We had some issues around that in the past. So so the biggest task I think in front of us is a greater understanding. Problems in front of us in the future, opportunities that are available that we don't want to miss. I can think of a few just off the top of my head. Of course, the tremendous environmental benefit that comes from using freight. We have the Climate Action Group report that shows us that we can get to our goals around climate change in the transportation sector fairly quickly and efficiently with available technology. Freight, I think, is going to play a significant role in that. What do we need to be mobilizing in terms of comprehensive planning? I think the FRED study is a good start, or the FRED report is going to be a good start. What agencies of state government do we need to mobilize for those purposes? Department of Transportation, of course, DEED, and others. For these smaller community services, these class 3, class 2, are we wanting to put more public dollars into improving those lines and making them more economically viable so that we're drawing more freight from further out, getting them up to those main lines. And really understanding the public benefit that's going to be derived and what the public can expect in return. Can we expect more give and take on these livability issues? Can we expect more give and take on passenger rail as we start building out intracity and intercity passenger rail? You know, there's this kind of, you know, no one really knows, you know, where does federal authority leave off and state authority pick up, and everyone just assumes the freights can do whatever they want, wherever they want, to whomever they want. And I don't think that's going to wash if freights are going to be coming to the state of Minnesota for more effort, more policy put in place, and more resources. So I'll stop talking there, and I'll be really interested in the conversation.
Well, Lee, I was waiting for the applause because it seemed that the audience had established the precedent that after one spoke, there was a polite applause.
So does it mean something that I didn't get applause? I'm worried now. It's a tough audience.
I got you covered, Scott. You got the applause. So, yes, I'm going to start with a story, I guess, of talking about freight and economics and economic development. As Lee mentioned, I have a little background. Actually, I have quite a checkered past, if you really want to know. But I have been a locomotive engineer at Penn Central Conrail, and I've been on the ground on the other end of the train back when cabooses were still vital in the whole process. They're not so much anymore, with the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. And of course, we're a young family, 4 little kids, and Mrs. Beard was quite put upon raising 4 little guys while I was on the extra board and gone days at a time, making a great amount of money, and actually working with my friend, Mr. Qualley. We spent a lot of time in cabooses talking politics and great questions about why we're here, where we're going in life, and all that stuff. It was great. And we even talked some railroading now and then. But here I was raising kids, being on the extra board, and it was a terrible way to raise kids. And so I noticed that there was an opening at the Chicago Northwestern down on 4th Street there in St. Paul. They had an opening in real estate and industrial development. And about that time, the Staggers Rail Act had just been passed. I had worked some of the branch lines and witnessed firsthand some of the awful treatment that the customers on the branch lines got from the car desk. Please give us cars. No, you can't have any cars. And as we were trying to get through the ICC abandonment process and things like that, I thought there's got to be a better way to treat these folks. And an opening came for real estate industrial development on my own dime. I got my real estate license. I went down, put in my resume, and I applied and got an interview with the director of real estate and industrial property. Actually, I think it really was, at the Chicago Northwestern. And as we chatted about things, and he said, what do you think you could bring to the department? Obviously, you have no industrial experience and don't know how to deal with these brokers and all this stuff. And I said, but I think I could help develop the traffic on these branch lines, and we could really build a robust business. And he laughed, and he said, son, you got this all wrong. Our industrial property department is not here to develop traffic. We're here to dispense with the property we've gotten. And he proceeded to brag to me how his office alone had garnered more money for the company dispatching and parceling out the old Minneapolis and St. Louis properties than they'd paid for the entire railroad back in 1964, whenever CNW bought the Louis, we called it, the Minneapolis-St. Louis Railroad. He'd gotten more property just selling the Minnesota properties, abandoning them and parceling them off, than we'd paid for the entire railroad. And I thought, whoa, if that's your standard of achievement, I'm in the wrong office. This is not what I thought railroading was about. I thought it was about actually building up small towns and taking care of customers and finding ways to get traffic back on the rails. So obviously I went on to other things than railroading at that time, because there still were the 4 little kids to feed. They'd grown quite accustomed to eating every day. There was the mortgage company. And I did want to be home for birthdays and Christmas from time to time. So I left the railroad and went off and did other things. That's another story for another day. But I think it was kind of indicative, the story I just told you was very indicative of the hidebound mentality of a highly regulated industry that had to deal with the ICC and Congress from time to time. And the way they looked at things was to minimize the damage and cut the costs. It wasn't increased service. I mean, good grief, when Norfolk Western came out with Big John, 100-ton coal car, they actually had to go to the government, federal government, for permission to establish rates for a 100-ton coal car because the rates were lower than what they'd been used to charging in the old 70-ton coal cars. What a way to run a railroad. So that's the background I came out of, and about that time the Staggers Rail Act came into being, and I think there was a new wave that took over where they could parcel out or let go of light-density railroads, the big railroads, the Class 1s that had stockholders to report to. And instead of just tearing them up and selling them and bragging about how much money you got for them, you could actually have somebody step forward, some entrepreneurial, community-minded soul could step up and say, I can do this better than Chicago Northwestern did it. And I allied myself with one of those groups and actually wrote a business plan for the Minnesota Prairie Line, what is now the Minnesota Prairie Line. And we actually did in-the-field surveys, talked to all the elevator owners, and tried to work with Chicago Northwestern on rate divisions. That's a whole other story for another day. And I wish, Senator, we had something to say about rate divisions and reciprocal switching, because we could do some fun things here, but that's actually a federal issue. Senator Klobuchar has left, but I think her staff is here. Mr. Oberstar is still here. Mr. Rose is still here. Know that as a conservative free market Republican, I'm very interested in the discussion on reciprocal switching and on interline divisions, particularly as it relates to short lines and regional railroads. And Mr. Minnick, while you're looking for things to talk about, I have a proposed question that you may want to consider when we're talking about economic development in the state of Minnesota, Lee. The gentleman from Benson Quinn, ADM, was just here talking about shuttle train rates. Is there an economic case to be made for having regionals or short lines actually aggregate trains into shuttle train lengths, 25, 50, 60 cars at a time, at an interchange point? Does that still make sense? Because I know every time you touch a car, you lose money. Every time you handle grain, you lose money. But is there a case to be made for some of our short lines and regionals where they can actually aggregate a shuttle train and hand it to a Class 1? There's probably an economic case on why that's not working, because if it was a good idea, somebody would be doing it. But I think you may want to think about that in your study. Maybe you too, Bill. Which leads me to my second point. Being a rail fan, a fan of all things transportation-wise, and I'm looking at the cover shot you have here. What a great shot. You've got 4 modes of transportation right there in that picture. You've got the river, which started it all.
In St. Paul.
In St. Paul, no less. I'm getting to you, Louis. You got the railroads, you got the highway, and if you look just off to the left there around the corner, there's the St. Paul Downtown Airport, another area of transportation I'm very fond of. And Louis, on Tuesday, we had a fantastic boat trip down the Minnesota River, which is a working river, down to Harriet Island, down to Deer Turf, talking about the river transportation, how it interfaces with the rails and with the highways. So what a great trip that was. So thank you for letting us into St. Paul. I appreciate that.
Our pleasure.
But thank you. The short lines began to develop, and in Minnesota policy history, and I'm going to try to wrap this up so others can talk and you can ask questions. I've got a whole list of things I want to talk about, but if this works right, I have some ringers in the audience who are going to ask the questions that we're going to talk about. So I'm just going to make 2 more quick points. When the short line wave hit in the late 80s and through the early 90s, and it's pretty much peaked and gone now, because lines that are torn up, they're gone. The states of Wisconsin, South Dakota, and Minnesota took 3 different routes to try to protect the rural economy and their rural communities. South Dakota, with the spine lines and being so beholden to the Milwaukee Road, they just bought the whole darn thing. They bought pretty much everything, and then, in my opinion, unfortunately handed the title to my friends at Burlington Northern. I love Burlington Northern. You should know, Mr. Rose, that Brian Sweeney is one of my favorite railroad lobbyists. Please keep him on the payroll. He's a good guy. But how am I doing, Brian? But anyhow, what they gave away with that, and that's the serious point I want to make, where they were grabbing the urgency of the moment and gave away the ability to do interline competition at the other end at their interchange points. They're pretty much captive to Burlington Northern. What Burlington wants, Burlington does, and they pretty much treated them well. But they lost the competitive advantage that Wisconsin, I think, managed to capture. When Wisconsin looked at the problem, they started buying the branch lines and then putting them out for bid to short line operators who enjoy multiple Class 1 interchange points, which I think serves the state even better, has made the railroads healthier. In fact, you've seen several of the short lines that have aggregated lines in Wisconsin have actually changed hands in some pretty fantastic purchases. mergers and acquisitions over the last few years. Minnesota didn't take that. We allowed counties to do regional rail authorities to buy the rails. 2 instances, Rock and Noble County actually bought it as a public entity, and of course the Minnesota Valley Regional Rail Authority, 3 or 4 counties down the up the Minnesota River bought their line and then shopped that around for operators to operate the lines. And that's what we have to this day. And as Senator Dibble noted, we have the Mercy Program and some tax conformity business, which was completely unsexy, but we bipartisanly passed that last time, Chair Hornstein, to bring Minnesota tax law in conformance with federal law so wealthy investors can actually work with the short lines to help rehabilitate their track with private money. A very good deal. And of course, Governor Quee did some bonding to save some of the lines in southern Minnesota, Austin to Jackson and up to Owatonna, I think. I don't know if we'll duplicate that, even though it's in the Constitution now. But there are different ways to handle the short line and regional railroads to preserve rail service in the smaller communities, where I think you're going to find in your report the economic vitality is critical if we're going to hold on to big employers doing big things in a big market. I've got some other things to talk about it, but as I mentioned, Lee, I've got people in the audience that may ask questions if I leave them some time.
Thank you. Louis Jambois from the St. Paul Port Authority.
Thanks very much, Lee. Again, my name is Louis Jambois. I was blessed with a semi-interesting name, which I have mispronounced my entire life. I probably should have been named Smith, but I am who I am, I guess. I'm the president of the St. Paul Port Authority, and as Lee identified in the intro, the purpose, the mission of the St. Paul Port Authority is to create quality job opportunities, increase the city's tax base, and foster sustainable development. And we do that through both the work on the St. Paul Harbor. Yes, there actually is a St. Paul Harbor. When I joined the St. Paul Port Authority, most people said, port, what port? But there is one there. 33 businesses, about 1,000 jobs. And then inland, we have about 21 additional business parks, Lori, and about 600 additional businesses and nearly 20,000 jobs. We are the industrial redeveloper in St. Paul. Lee invited me today, and Tom, not so much though to talk about transportation, but really to talk about a very similar issue that we face and that rail freight transportation faces. I was asked to react to Lee and Tom's research, the interim findings, and I want to go back there for just a second. There were 5 interim findings. If you boil those down to 2, the 2 findings are freight rail is a major contributor to the state's economy. It provides great jobs. It provides great service. It has a huge statewide economic impact, and without it, the state's economy would be in dire straits. That's sort of finding number 1. Agree with that completely. That makes perfect sense. Finding number 2 is it's not well understood or appreciated by the general public, and sometimes, and I think Scott talked about this, sometimes there's outward opposition. All right. Those are the exact same findings that the Port Authority came up with when we commissioned the Initiative for a Competitive Inner Cities, the ICIC, out of Boston, to do a study of St. Paul's industrial base. Fabulous economic impact, very, very ununderstood by the public. The industrial base in St. Paul subsidizes services to housing in a way that people in the residential areas probably don't understand, and it really finances the services to the 1/3 of St. Paul's city tax base that is tax exempt. 1/3 of the city of St. Paul's tax exempt. It's not the residential property that provides services, that finances services to that tax exempt property. It is the industrial property. All right. So why is there a disconnect? And it was identified in your stuff. Why is there a disconnect between the value of freight rail, or in the case of St. Paul Port Authority's general industrial development, and the daily lives of most Minnesotans? Why does that occur? Well, it's really understandable. Industrial development versus other land uses is really not very, the population doesn't access industrial property in the same way it accesses other land uses. We all live in houses, we go into offices, we shop at retail centers, we roll into institutional places like this. I would be willing to bet that this room is a bit of an exception, but most Minnesotans have never been in an industrial building in their lives and never will. So when they're looking at all the land use options, which land use option might be forgotten? It's pretty clear. When it comes to freight rail versus other transportation options, the same thing applies. Everyone knows knows about cars and car transportation. We fly on planes, we get on transit buses, light rail, whatever. We all ride bikes. Even I still ride a bike. Shouldn't, probably. So how many of us have hopped a freight line lately? That's okay. If I asked for how many have been in a car today, I think I'd probably get a pretty bigger deal. So what happens? So what happens with all of that? Why is this a policy issue? Because it puts pressure on policymakers to limit or even eliminate the uses when something shinier shows up. It's really pretty clear and pretty understandable. And policymakers, even those who support the kinds of things that we do, get stuck in between the value of the work that we do and the negative attitudes of their constituents. It's a crummy place to put the policymakers. 2 minutes, I'll be done. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to recognize that just as there's an intersection between rail and truck and barge traffic, there is an intersection between policy, politics, and public perception. And we need to address that intersection. We need to help out our policymakers by going directly to the public with the importance of the things that we do. We have to remove the disconnect between the value of this stuff that you all have articulated extremely well in the daily lives of John Q. Public. We got to put the information in front of them in terms and stories that they can relate to and support. We've got to go anywhere, anytime to deliver the message. We got to go to places where the message might be met with skepticism or outright opposition. We got to do it over and over and over again. It's what we did after we did our ICIC study. It's what we did at the Port Authority to take the findings out on the road. We've had over 100 presentations to talk about the value for individual people's lives, and we tried to communicate it in that way. We've been to neighborhood groups, business groups, nonprofits, philanthropic groups, educational groups, intergovernmental groups, faith groups, you name it, we've been there, and we've just gotten started. Al Lovejoy has been a great help from the city of St. Paul on this. Has this worked? I mean, we're doing it at a very micro level. It's the St. Paul Port Authority and growing the city of St. Paul. Freight rail has a much broader challenge. Does it work? Maybe it does. Some of our themes that have been coming out of that outreach thing have now been coming back to us from some of the most surprising places. Some of the support for what we do is coming back to us from some of the most surprising places. Number one response to our outreach, we had no idea what the hell the Port Authority actually did, so thank you. Number two is, oh, you do not suck. And if my challenge to the freight community, to the freight rail community, is we know you don't suck. You know you don't suck, but a whole bunch of people out there don't know that. And getting out, taking the used work and getting it out. I mean, I'm not a marketing guy. I'm a pointy-headed development guy, but even I've figured this out. Getting out and talking about the value. You've got a fabulous story to tell, a fabulous story. You just can't take it to these guys and not anyplace else and expect it to land. You just can't. So that's it. I'm sorry for taking so long.
And Bill, you get the final word of this panel until we ask questions. Go ahead.
All right. Well, good morning. My name is Bill Gardner. I'm with the Minnesota DOT. And first of all, let me pass along the regrets of Commissioner Zelli, who couldn't be here today, unfortunately, due to his schedule. But he's keenly interested in this topic. He has been engaged in conversations around the state about the value of the transportation system, the benefits that all of us realize as users, both on the passenger side and on the freight side, and of course the need to continue to invest in that system. And I think if he were here today, he would remind us of a few things like 50% of our state highway pavements are more than 50 years old. 35% of our state bridges are more than 50 years old. Now, I know there's a number of people in this room who are more than 50 years old, and hopefully you don't require immediate replacement, including myself, maybe a little rehab work. But when we're talking about 50-year-old infrastructure, we think that's something that we need to be addressing. I want to thank the university, Lee, BNSF, others who have been involved in this research and the forum, because as Louis is talking about, it helps tell the story of freight and the value to Minnesota, to its economy, how it serves businesses, allows them to grow, and so forth. And we do need to do that in much more visible and aggressive ways. We've been trying to capture the story of freight in some of our formal planning documents, the long-range transportation plan we adopted last year called Minnesota Go, our state rail plan, our state freight plan, and our new ports and waterways plan. You know, yesterday, Commissioner Sieben from the Department of Employment and Economic Development announced that we had regained all of the jobs that we lost in the recession. And Deed also said that trade, transportation, and utilities led all sectors in Minnesota job growth over the past year, adding 18,300 jobs. So I think this theme of freight and logistics as an engine for driving job growth is one that we can take advantage of, that we should talk more about, and it's one that I think resonates with a lot of stakeholders and the general public. MnDOT, I think, in the last couple of years as a department has become much more intentional about the linkage between transportation and economic development. We have introduced several programs with the assistance of our friends from the legislature on the highway side that are specifically aimed at economic development and ensuring economic competitiveness for the state. Our Transportation Economic Development Program, which we administer jointly with Deed, has invested $72 million in state funds, leveraged $127 million in private and other funds to construct highway projects that specifically benefit businesses for retaining jobs and growing jobs, thousands of jobs around the state. Recently, in our corridor investment management strategy, we announced the award of $30 million for 10 different highway projects around the state that's leveraging another $70 million in other sources of funding, again, with economic competitiveness as a key selection criteria for those projects. And finally, our new Corridors of Commerce program that was adopted by the legislature last year, where we'll be investing up to $300 million in highway capacity improvement projects, in freight mobility projects, and these are new words for us that are in statute, and for eliminating freight bottlenecks. Those are all on the highway side. So what about freight rail? What about ports? You know, there's a number of states like Wisconsin, like Kansas, and others that have multimodal transportation economic development programs. And lo and behold, they make investment decisions based on benefit cost, documented public benefits, and return on investment, regardless of mode, not driven by the particular restrictions of various funding sources and funding silos. At the federal level, we've had the Tiger program, which was mentioned. Over 1/3 of Tiger funds that have been distributed nationally have been for freight rail projects, and also significant investments in our port development program. It really has been the key freight infrastructure improvement program at the national level. Mention was made, I think Senator Klobuchar mentioned the Port of Duluth award of $10 million. We're matching that $10 million with $2.7 million of state port assistance funds, along with some of the port's own funds, to accomplish that renovation and expansion of Dock C and D so they can take advantage of future business opportunities. So it may be time for us to consider more of a multimodal approach, a Tiger-like program at the state level as well, so we can take advantage of some of these opportunities. By the way, it took the Port of Duluth 5 tries through the Tiger program to get this award because that program is so oversubscribed. There's so much demand for the limited funds that have been made available. Finally, I think we ought to be talking about some new institutional initiatives and structures. In Wisconsin, they've introduced a freight-friendly Wisconsin initiative and are now holding annual governors' freight industry summits, by invitation only, by the way, getting very high-level business representatives in those discussions. We've been discussing the concept of a freight rail forum, similar to what we have on the passenger rail side, where we bring together rail carriers, shippers, communities, and agencies who are concerned about freight rail issues and try to advance them. There was mention, Senator Dibble mentioned the FRED program. FRED is the relative of TED, Freight Rail Economic Development Study, that we've been putting the finishing touches on, and we'll have some good recommendations coming out of that, including modifications to the existing Minnesota Rail Service Improvement Program, the revolving loan program, to introduce more incentives and flexibility in that program. Greater collaboration in a more structured way with DEED and also local economic development planners, and some very specific products and services like a rail shipper's toolkit. What we found out is a lot of shippers around the state haven't considered rail. They don't know how to access it. There's a lot of unknowns, and so this is to try to make that connection. And so there's a certain degree of communication and marketing and outreach that needs to occur to grow rail shipping in Minnesota. And I'm at the stop point, so I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we have time for a couple of questions from Representative Beard's ringers, if they're out there somewhere. So who wants to go first? I don't think you're one of the ringers. But go ahead.
I'm Todd Graham. I'm an analyst with Metropolitan Council. Lee, you started this morning by saying that there are infrastructure needs for railways as well as every other kind of infrastructure. Senator Dibble has said that maybe public resources can be part of the solution, but there are some questions about railways accountability and responsiveness. So my simple question for the panel is, what does something like public-private partnership look like for railway systems? And I know that Representative Beard has already given the example with the Wisconsin model. Are there other examples? Are there other visions for what public-private partnership could look like? And if the Wisconsin model is something to emulate, is the timing right to do something like that in Minnesota?
Who wants to take that one?
Well, I could jump in real quickly from a St. Paul Port Authority perspective. We're already in public-private partnerships because, of course, the dock walls at the port are public infrastructure. The dirt behind those dock walls belongs to the St. Paul Port Authority, and we lease that dirt to businesses that build their buildings and run their businesses from that space, and then that space interacts with both truck traffic and train traffic, of course, freight rail traffic. So we've developed the infrastructure. You know, everyone's talked about infrastructure. We've developed the infrastructure that supports the other infrastructure that is in the country, the private infrastructure, and the private business community. And to me, that's the easiest. That's the lowest hanging fruit in terms of public-private partnerships, is figuring out the individual roles of the various entities that fit naturally for them, and then pursuing those roles in a collaborative and coherent way.
Senator Dibble?
Thanks. Of course, it all depends on what you mean by public-private partnership. That means something very specific in some contexts. And spoken of much more broadly in a lot of other settings. I'll assume for the purpose of this conversation, this is a broader conversation. And absolutely, I think we have some experience with PPPs, or I should say public-private cooperation in Minnesota around freight. The Mercy program and the things that Louis described. Doing some of the work around the crossings, et cetera. And so I think, that's really the question in front of us is, do we take that up to the next level? And what does that look like? Does it look, are there elements of public ownership of facilities or not? Is the public simply in a posture of matching private dollars, private investments? And if so, what is the return? Because we absolutely have to account for the return, whether that's inside the envelope or we're measuring external benefits and the like, or are we in a position of facilitating financing, those sorts of things. But I think, I think the Fred study is going to explore some of the parameters and ideas, and I'm interested and anxious for those results. And then you touched on, what can we expect back in terms of accountability, in terms of public policy benefit.
Representative Beard?
I can think of a couple of examples on the national scene where this has happened. Norfolk Southern engaged with the federal government on the I-81, Interstate 81 corridor project. Is that the Crescent project, I believe? And then, of course, CSX, their sworn competitor in the east, wasn't going to be left out, so they started a Heartland project between Columbus and through the mountains to upgrade their track to be able to handle double-stack trains. The trade-off there was they had performance parameters to meet in the number of trucks that they could keep off of the interstates. That was the public interest in putting a couple $100 million into what amounts to private property. Railroads are private property, and God bless them for being that. I'm proud of you for maintaining your rates, your profitability, and rebuilding your infrastructure. Thank you for $95 million of upgrades in Minnesota next year, Matt. But there is a trade-off when you ask the government to get involved, and in the case of Norfolk Southern CSX, they had specific parameters they have to meet in reducing truck traffic on interstates in the mountains where I grew up, and it's not just an easy matter to add another lane when you got to carve it out of the side of a mountain somewhere. In Minnesota, we've had kind of that partnership with BNSF. Whenever we put the North Star up to Big Lake, we had to protect the freight movements, which meant we had to, as the public, had to invest in some crossovers, extending some sidings into double track and so on and so forth to accommodate that. Again, there was a public purpose very clearly there. On a smaller scale, I think I could point to Minnesota Valley and the Rock County, Nobles County case, but perhaps we'll be talking more about that in the future after both of these studies, both Lee's study and Bill's study, come back to the legislature next year.
Did you have, Bill?
I would just add, I would agree with the nexus of passenger rail and freight rail in our state rail plan. We have said that we cannot be introducing passenger rail services at the expense of the freight rail industry, and we view it, though, as a win-win opportunity. Certainly now, particularly in the Twin Cities, there's some conflicts with the plans and operations of railroads, and we need to work through those. But overall, there's a tremendous opportunity for allowing for the expansion of freight rail lines and the accommodation of passenger rail lines. The other area I wanted to point to is intermodal access. We still have a number of shippers in this state that have to drag containers hundreds of miles to either the big intermodal yards, container yards in the Twin Cities, or to Winnipeg and so forth. And a number of communities are interested in having that service more accessible for their shippers. And we've started to see the introduction around the country in Wisconsin and so forth, some smaller intermodal facilities, but a lot of ingredients have to come together. Availability of containers from the steamship companies, certainly the railroad service, commitments from shippers, and community acceptance. And I think there is a role for the public sector to try to find suitable locations to build land assembly and maybe assist with some of the infrastructure, highway approaches and so forth. So traditionally those have been areas for public-private partnership, developing those intermodal facilities.
Great. Well, I want to thank the panel for your great remarks, getting the juices going. And sorry we don't have time for more of those ringers that you put out there, but